Okay, I'm here with none other than Nick Leeson. How are you today, Nick?
Very well, thank you.
Okay, you've got an extremely interesting background. I would like to talk to you a little bit about that. I believe that there's a huge amount people can learn from other people's experiences, and hopefully, as we get into it, we can learn a little bit about what sort of motivated you to get involved in finance and becoming a trader. And of course, some of the outcomes that took place that have been well documented. So if you'd like to give us a little bit of a background of who is Nick Leeson?
Yeah, it's always difficult to know where to start. You know, there's a public persona which is always focused on the collapse of Barings Bank. So, you know, and it depends what people have read and what people have heard in terms of what they're you know, what they think of me type of thing, and also sometimes a little bit from what industry they come from. So it's kind of weird. And then, you know, I suppose you've also got my own appreciation of who I am, and I'd always described myself as quite normal, you know, working class kid who grew up on a council estate in Watford and wanted to achieve a little bit more than his parents had and have a more stable existence, a bit more money in the bank. So it's a classic sort of working class kid who wants to move up the ladder a little bit, I suppose. So was always quite motivated to achieve, was always looking for success. And, you know, if I got success, I always wanted more. So academically, I was quite good at school. I think you go through a bit of a wobbly phase when you're in the 14 to 17 bracket. I did that and sort of discovered alcohol and girls for a while, and that probably detracted from the grade A student that I used to be prior to that. And then at the age of 18, started working in the City of London. So I swerved going to university. I at the time when I was trying to work out what I wanted to do, I didn't think it was going to get me any further than the job opportunity that I was given, which was starting out with Coutts at number 15 Lombard Street, right in the heart of the city. So that's what I did. I started work there, and never really anticipated working in a bank. I was kind of a little bit more inclined towards the law, as I ultimately proved a few years later on. But you know, that's kind of where I saw my career at first, was in that sort of area. And you know, the plan was to go to university and read law, but I was offered a job with Coutts, and kind of, you know, I took that opportunity and enjoyed every day of working in the city from that point on, and excelled, did well in all of the organisations that I worked for. Probably at the age of 21, 22, found myself, probably at 21, found myself in Hong Kong, and then Japan, Indonesia, and ultimately Singapore, where you know, things started to go wrong and ultimately led to the collapse of Barings Bank.
Okay, the world's a very different place now. It must have been quite exciting times with the travel and connecting with different cultures and different environments. But before we focus on that and move ahead, can you give us a bit more insight as to what life was like back at Coutts as a 18, 19, 20-year-old guy, traveling in and out of the city every day? I mean, would you consider it to be as more sophisticated today or back then? You know, was everybody a little, did everybody carry themselves differently in comparison to the sort of new world that we're living in now? I mean, just give us an idea of what life was like back then.
I think the easiest way to, so we're going back a long time now. So when I started working in the city in 1995 when I was 18, and it was the breaking down of the old guard, if you like. It was the Big Bang era. So you went from a quite a traditional blue-blooded stockbroking type of environment, where the big banks became more dominant. So it used to be very much, you know, my word is my bond, and there was a certain type of people that worked in the majority of the city. There was still you know, the people that, like me, that they referred to barrow boys who traded on the live stock on the live trading floor. But it was, you know, it was very old school, very traditional, very blue-blooded. You know, people coming from a select number of schools. And then it changed around 85 because there were lots of big new banks coming into the city. Well, 85 to 87, lots of big new banks coming into the city. Meant there was a lot of more people needed to populate and employ within those. So it meant there was a far, you know, or there was much more opportunity for somebody like me who probably traditionally would have described as coming from the wrong side of the tracks in terms of people that would have worked in the city at that time. So there was a lot about what you know, a lot about who you knew as opposed to what you knew. I think that's changed over the years, and you know, the type of products that we used to trade or that people used to invest in back in the day were quite vanilla, whereas everything is far more sophisticated and complex these days as well.
Was it difficult being from the wrong side of the tracks? I mean, did you find that you were disadvantaged at any point, or you felt that you know you were having to work a bit harder to be taken as serious, or did people give you know were you given a fair crack of the whip once you were invited to take the role at the company?
Yeah, no, I always believe I was given a fair crack of the whip. I mean, I think once you're in, you know, everything goes on, or everything is based on ability. And you know, I was always, you know, if I go back to those days, you know, prior to Singapore, and even whilst I was in Singapore, you know, I was always the type of employee that you wanted. I was very hardworking, very accurate, very good at what I did. And for that reason, given the opportunity. Otherwise, I wouldn't have transgressed or moved through the organisations that I did as quickly as I did, and as well being promoted through those organisations as well. So, you know, just to give you a bit of insight about me as well, I suppose. I was invited to a board meeting at a South African bank several years ago, and the subject matter was risk and trying to identify people that potentially might pose a problem within their organisation. And there were the head of risk was a lady who was asking me a few questions, and one of the and this kind of dovetails back into the question that you've asked. But she asked, you know, if I was asked or if I had to list what my biggest attributes were in terms of getting me to where I was within all of the organisations that I work for. And I had to think about the answer for a while. You know, one of them would have been that I was very socially adept. So I found it easy to move from a working class background where I grew up and spent the weekends into working in quite blue-blooded, very traditional organisations that I work for, Barings and Coutts being two of those, Morgan Stanley being slightly different. But yeah, no, I never felt out of place. I could hold myself in any environment, and that kind of stood to me as well when I was in prison in Singapore, because I was able to get by. I wasn't going to say get along with anybody, but you get by in that situation. And if you're not socially adept and you're not able to handle yourself and you're not able to appraise the situation, you know, prison is definitely going to expose that. And a prison in Singapore that's full of triad gangs is going to be a very uncomfortable place if you're not able to hold yourself in that particular situation, which I was able to do.
I think there's quite a common theme there. I mean, if you're obviously something of a chameleon in your characteristic, but you're able to adapt. The same thing was said to me when I interviewed Sean Atwood some time ago. You know, he'd gone into jail over in the US, and he felt that was one of the major catalysts to him getting through his sentence. You know, is it a situation where is there a crossover from that characteristic into how you manage the demise of Barings in regard to being able to be think quickly on your feet and sort of be able to keep a keep a firm exterior, even if on the inside things are getting a little bit sort of hot and uncomfortable.
Yeah, there's a bit of it. I mean, I don't think it's all of it by any stretch of the imagination. I think, and you know this yourself from any trading situation that you've been in over the years. Being confident is half of the battle. Like if you're confident and you're very sure about yourself in a situation, the inclination is that people are going to believe you. So, as much as there was this ability to get along with people and get by and move between those different environments that you found yourself in, and they weren't necessarily all social. Being confident, bordering on being ballsy in terms of the way that you approach some of the questions that you were asked, really puts you on that higher ground, if you like, in terms of the scenario. So, and people, I think, defer, regardless of industry. People are quite confident about what they're doing, and that confidence, even though it belied, the complete turmoil that was going on within me, in terms of trying to conceal and continue with the situation that I was in, definitely deflected an awful lot of interrogation and investigation that really should have followed through.
We can talk about that. We can perhaps maybe touch on compliance or lack of compliance, or where the loopholes within the compliance was. But what was life like for you as you entered Singapore? It's a new world, and a world away from London. I mean, was it something that you adapted to again as part of your characteristic very quickly, or was there a couple of were there bumps in the road? Tell us a little bit about life moving into.
Yeah, I mean, there were definitely bumps on the road. I mean, the first time that I'd spent a bit of time in Tokyo when I worked for Morgan Stanley. Which is a definitely a very, very different culture during that time of the early 90s. So Indonesia and Jakarta was probably, well, I was in Hong Kong for a month, and then I was in Jakarta for about a year and a half after that. And Jakarta was the Wild West back in those days. It was quite dangerous. We had a bodyguard who had a gun on him, and he escorted us everywhere. He'd pick us up at the hotel in the morning, take us into the office, and take us back to the hotel in the evening. So there wasn't much of a social life until you kind of got a little bit used to it. And this guy's name was Tino, and you'd say to Tino, "Okay, look, it's Friday. You go home for the weekend. We're going out," type of thing. And you'd go to some places that were quite seedy. They were definitely very dangerous. But it was, you wanted to be the fabric of, or involved in the fabric of the place that you were, and you also want to enjoy yourself as well. So it was definitely a bit of a risk taking during that period. But Jakarta was probably the first place I'd been in for such a long period of time, and some of the time that I was there, I was on my own, because there was a real nobody had a proper work permit. I think there were 6 or 7 of us who were moved from Hong Kong down to Indonesia. Nobody had a work permit. We used to have to go back to Singapore for a day and then re-enter and get another stamp in our passport. But there was a big crackdown just before Christmas, and I think a load of people at JP Morgan were marched out of their offices. So I was left there for a good period of time on my own until Barings decided to send some people back down there, and it's quite lonely, So that's the major bump, but you enjoy it. You're well paid. You're living on expenses. What's there to complain about? You're in a 5-star hotel. I stayed in the Mandarin Oriental for 6 months. I stayed in the Hotel Borobudur for the best part of a year. So you were very well treated. You were very well looked after. It's nice and warm, and there's, you can go down to Bali, and you can go to Jakarta and other places, and really experiment the world, or experience the world on somebody else's money, which was the banks, really. So, you know, what's not to like?
Sounds like you probably weren't sort of spending your days, you know, checking out the, you know, the flowers and the rare butterflies of Bali, but more so enjoying yourself on the party scene, work hard and play hard. We know that's a big factor in this whole sort of city corporate life. Tell us about that aspect of it. You know, the both the risks at work, the risks out of work, you know, the parties, anything sort of that rings to mind back from them days. Anything outrageous that you want to share with the audience?
I don't think there's anything you want to share, but you know, I think in the you know the current PC world that we see in the last 10 years, we've all been knocked up long ago. You know, it was like I didn't like it. No, I remember when I moved to Hong Kong. The idea was that I was ultimately going to be moving to Sydney to run the trading floor down on the Sydney futures. And just as a bit of a holding role, I was sent to Hong Kong, and I hated Hong Kong because it was full of you know, very traditional expats who were, you know, they were generations of expats, so they were very colonial. They used to look down on the locals that lived in Hong Kong, and they were very rude and nasty, and there's none of that in me, you know. Like everybody's equal, and I just didn't like it. I think I got into a fight whilst I was in Hong Kong, but it was with one of the old school people at Barings that had been there for many years, just because I just didn't like the way that he was with some of the people that worked for him. You know, he used to look down on everybody, and you know, I'm sort of one of these people that I won't ask somebody to do something unless I'm prepared to do it myself. And that didn't exist. There was this, I suppose, entitled is probably the best way to describe it. But there was a lot of people who believed that they were entitled, and I don't think anybody's entitled to look down on anybody else.
So, with your characteristics, your experiences, you know, being able to adapt in any situation, clearly a team player, somebody who's prepared to treat everybody with the respect that they're due. I mean, that will, I'm sure that will have played, you know, massively into the hands of you being a popular person within the workplace. Is that fair to say?
Sure. And yeah, look, when I was in Singapore, one of the guys, or the guy who was the head trader for us on the floor, you know, he had a bit of a problem with his wife at the time. I think they ended up getting divorced, and he lived in my house for a couple of months, and they were the people that I wanted to associate with. You know, I mean, just, you know, when I worked in the city, I very rarely would go out with people from the city. They just, you know, they weren't my type of people. Like I go to work to do a job and get by and achieve, and that's the focus when I was working in the city. And then if I want to go out and have a bit of fun, a bit of risk taking, as you described earlier, I'm going back to Watford, to the people that I know, that I trust, and that I want to be with. That's the difference. That's my time. And Singapore is the same. You know, like I didn't go down to Boat Quay and into Harry's, the place that is, you know, reputed to be one of my favourite haunts whilst I was in Singapore, because it was full of expats who I really didn't have any time for. You know, I would much rather go down to the other end of Boat Quay and fraternise with the people that worked for me, in the Singaporean or the Indian or the Chinese, and normal people. You know, I needed part of that as well, and that's always been part of me. You know, I don't want to waste my time going to some fancy thing just to see a couple of people who everybody holds in high esteem. I'd rather go down the pub with somebody who's real and have a bit of a laugh, and probably fall out of the all out of the pub at later in the evening, but had a proper evening. That's more me. I've shared the stage with some very, very famous and respected people over the years when I've been talking. But whenever I'm asked who was the most inspirational or the best speaker out of all of them, none of them really did anything for me, to be honest with you.
For somebody that's so popular, somebody who's played the team game, likes to keep himself close to people that he's got, strong relationships with and circles. What's the biggest misconception from the immediate interpretation of Nick Leeson and who you are, and the reality aside from this? Because, as you say, you talk about Harry's Barings, some of the haunts. It sounds to me that perhaps the personality that's being created by the medium and the real person that is Nick Leeson quite different. So, I mean, what's the biggest misconception?
I don't know. It's one of those things, I suppose, that if you worry about it too much, it probably it would wreck your head.
I do the same.
I don't even. They're two very different people. I think what happened over the years is that at the time of the collapse of the bank, there was I was this trader who lived in a penthouse, had a yacht, and drove around in fast cars, and it was that stereotypical trader of the time, and that was a million miles away from the truth. I mean, I took a pay cut to go to Singapore because I wanted the opportunity more than anything else. I mean, at that time, nobody took a pay cut to move. If you were going out to Singapore on an expat salary, you were wringing every last penny out of it. I didn't live on Orchard Road. I lived in Bukit Timah, which was the arse end of Singapore at the time. It was out where the racetrack is. It's probably a very nice part of Singapore now, but at the time it wasn't where you found expats. And it was the opportunity that I craved more than anything else.
Well, look, you definitely took the opportunity, and with both hands, as we know, it's well documented. You sort of seem to come across as a guy who's got conscience. How difficult is it? Let's talk to us before we go into that. Talk to us a bit about the collapse of Baring and how this small problem become a big problem and then become a major problem. Give us an idea of the time it took for all of this to unfold, and again, the holes in compliance that allowed it to go on.
Well, it's a story of incompetence and negligence on a grand scale. Mine very much at the forefront of that. I was out in my depth. I didn't have the skill. Once I got into a difficult situation and didn't make the right decisions, and failed that early test of my basic honesty and skills, to be able to pull myself back out of the situation. I could have put my hand up at any point and asked for help and advice, but I was 25 years of age, and I believed that I could cope with anything, and I saw asking for help and advice as a sign of weakness. So I didn't do it, and that kind of that sort of fell into 1990s banking. Everybody was great at talking about successes, but nobody spoke about failure. And because success and achieving was so important to me, I had a huge fear of failure. So talking to people about what was happening was definitely not on the agenda, and there wasn't really any listening ear at Barings at the time or anywhere around me to be able to do that either. So we had a trading error one day on the trading floor. Knew exactly what I was supposed to do. Had to refer it back up the line, make everybody aware of it. So the very next morning after we discovered this, it was small at the time, it was technically $10,000, which I know isn't a small number, but in terms of the trading world at the time, it was a small number. and went into the office of the guy in Singapore who ran the operations for Barings, and I told him about it, and told me to refer it to London, and London didn't open for 4 or 5 hours, and I took the opportunity in that 4 or 5 hour period to try and work myself out of the position of the loss. And one of the reasons, and I don't want to hide behind this, but the girl that made the error, I felt accountable for. I felt responsible for, and I didn't want her to lose her job, and she was probably more likely to do that than me. And so I didn't refer it to London. The loss got, the loss got bigger throughout the day. I'm now more complicit in what's happened, and it becomes more of a dilemma over the next few days, and I continue down that same path, trying to correct the situation, because for me, now I'm gonna, if this is going to come out in the wash, or I'm going to tell people about what's going on, the thing that's very much front and center is my failure. And that was the one thing, seriously, throughout the whole period of 2.5 years, just over 2.5 years in Singapore, that I just could not cope with. And still find difficult to this day. It's from an early age, it was all about succeeding and achieving and getting somewhere. And there was always a level further that you could go. When you're that focused on success as I was during that period, failure is just not an option. And it wasn't for me.
Is it one of these situations, Nick, that that whole industry is built on this persona and reputation, and I almost refer to it as the fake it till you make it type society. I find loads of guys I've come across there, hobnobbing around the city, and they'll almost look, super slick and smart. But it's actually when you get up the West End and you've got a guy in a desert suit with a 100 grand watch on, he's the guy who's got the money and doing all the big business. And this kid around the square mile is just trying to make it up until he gets there and has a crack at it. Does that make it harder as you grow into that world and into that position of great sort of stature? The foundations of it really start early on, don't they? Does that have a big input to it, do you think?
Yeah, I suppose the big question all of the time is how do you keep yourself grounded? How do you keep yourself normal? There is a lot of there's a lot of pretense and pretentiousness about what goes on. But that, again, like trading and the markets at that time were very almost gladiatorial. Everybody knows who's making money. Everybody knows who's losing money. It's a zero-sum game, and the ones that are making money, they make it very obvious. And there's big bonuses being paid, and big bonuses come big rewards as well. So people driving around in very flash cars and things like that. So there's a lot of trappings of success as well. That I agree with you. I always used to laugh, and this is a genuine story. When I worked at Coutts, I don't know what the criteria is these days, but basically, nobody who banks at Coutts is anything less than a millionaire. And so at Lombard Street, they used to have some fancy dinners from time to time, and one of their most famous customers within Lombard Street was Spike Milligan, the comedian. And so they used to have these dinners in the big boardroom and whatever else. So Spike Milligan, I think, obviously a slightly unusual character. When he used to come round to the dinners, or he came to one, I think he only really came to one, and he sat underneath the table for the whole dinner, just to present that he didn't really agree with what was going on. And as he was leaving, he turned around and he said, "Next time, just put the money in my account. Don't bother inviting me." Because he didn't like the type of event that he was going to. But I agree with you. Sometimes it is the guy that is probably a little bit quieter and less obvious who's done better.
obvious thing to talk about right now is the collapse bearing, all of the emotional side of it, you know, some of the details. But I think it's well documented. It's been well trodden ground. Unless there's anything on that particular side of things you feel like you want to clear up or talk about, then you know, shoot and let's go for it. But I'm more interested in, you know, you do sound like a conscientious guy. You do sound like somebody who cares from the experience.
You can't break a bank and be conscientious.
Well, no, exactly. But I mean, how have you how have you resolved it in your own mind? You know,
Well,
where do you go moving forward in your own headspace? And you know, you've
you
obviously
do,
talked.
I suppose the answer is it takes time, right? So you do it slowly, and I think it's with it's true of anything in life. If, if something, if you have a behaviour that's wrong, and it can be any behaviour, being drugs, drink, or anything like that, or you know, a period of your life where you've done something very seriously wrong, which obviously happened to me during the collapse of Barings Bank. The first thing you need to do is you need to own it. Right? So you need to be responsible. You have to take full accountability, and you have to square that away within yourself. And that's difficult for a lot of people to do in normal life. For me, it was made a little bit easier, and weirdly so, because I was in prison in Singapore. And so you really have to pull back the veneer and look within, and look at certain situations that you're in and things that you did. And it's not just from the bank perspective, you know, things that we did during the day, during the days in Singapore and in trading, the way I was in the relationship with my wife and with other people at that particular time. And the conclusion you come to is you don't particularly like yourself. Now that's very then on a knife edge, right? Because it's either very humbling because you've got to that base level, or it's very dangerous because you can't deal with it, you can't cope with it. But it's the point from which you start to build yourself back up, and that's really what it was for me. So I spent the best part of 4 years in prison in Singapore, keeping a diary and looking at things and situations that I'd been in and the way that I reacted, and coming to the conclusion that I didn't particularly like that, and then thinking of how I would have preferred to react or behave. And that then gave me a target, if you like, in terms of how I would like to improve myself in the future.
Nick, would you say that you're talking you talked about improving yourself and coming to terms with the you know the changes? I'm sure through that 4 year period in prison, you perhaps looked at other situations and said, you know, I've made a real mess here, but yeah, I'm not the first person to make it. You've probably seen lots of examples of it, you know, since then. Do you have a view on, you know, has the market really changed much since the great epic errors and oversights that happened on your watch? Has any, you know, has that we see these things continue to go on. We see lots of cases of fraud and deception in the market. Has it changed as a result? Is the market learning? Because we as people have to learn from our mistakes. Is the market learning from its mistakes? Because we still see this happening.
I think the answer is probably that it does learn, but it learns too slowly, which means that there's always another opportunity. I mean, you wake up today to Wirecard claiming insolvency in Germany. And that's going to end up being a huge fraud. So it clearly doesn't learn completely. I think that might be too much of a generalization. It doesn't learn quick enough. I mean, whatever. I think when you look at from a trading perspective, you look at markets, you look at the improvements that have happened over the years. There have been an awful lot of improvements. There are better people in control roles, better risk managers, better compliance officers, better stress testing, and all those sort of things. But none of those things are going to avoid fraud. The fraud is changing all the time as well, and competency of these sort of people. But it is about, I think the one thing with financial markets that I believe more than anything else, when things are good, and there's money being made. There is no area of industry that is more complacent, and they forget the lessons of yesteryear, and that's why these situations occur. I don't think there'll ever be a large-scale rogue trader in the future because controls are in place to stop that. So there are rogue traders, and but they're stopped far sooner than they would have been 20 years ago, 30 years ago. But as we've seen, Singapore's had a few episodes of rogue trading just this year, or in the last 12 months anyway. So they definitely still occur, but you're not going to get the whoppers like me. Although I think somebody told me I was down to 14th on the list of these days.
Okay. So we, Wirecard's a good example. We see Carson Block and Muddy Waters making big waves in international and global markets by exposing these types of things. Matt Earl and Shadow Fall and those guys have talked a lot about Wirecard. Is that something that you consider getting involved in? You know, you talked about risk, working for companies and sort of trying to spot where there might be holes or problems. Given your experiences, is there opportunity for you to go and do something like that? Is it something of interest?
I'm 53 these days. I'm slowing down. Look, I suppose over the years it's something that I would have considered at that particular time. My name's too dirty from a business perspective. I tend to get pulled out as a man of intrigue who's got a good story and you can tell it quite well. In order to promote something else that an organisation is trying to sell. I just think in that old traditional English way, it was an English bank that collapsed, and the stigma attached to my name is still very loud. And whereas in the US, probably poacher turned gamekeeper type of analogy might have seen a different path for me. But you play the cards you're dealt, and I don't have a problem with that. It's again part of being accountable and responsible is you don't blame anybody else. I shouldn't have done it. I was fairly stupid throughout the whole episode. But I'm not going to go crying to anybody because I have this woes mentality. You get one life and you have to enjoy it as much as you possibly can. I've managed to curtail my need for success, and my family are extremely important to me, and I focus on those. And your values change. But I don't want a job in a bank. And I do okay out of what I do.
Tell us a little bit about that. I mean, how do you sort of, we're coming to the end of the podcast, but I mean, sure. How are you spending your days? How do you apply your trade?
I still trade, so it's very much retail trading these days, and I think when you're involved in the financial markets at the pointy end of stuff, it's difficult to completely leave that alone at any time. It's fun, it's exciting, there's a certain addictive element to it as well. I don't think there's too many industries that give you the same sort of excitement. It releases a few neurotransmitters that most jobs don't do. So I still do that, and I get mentoring around the psychology of trading. Everybody finds it difficult to take a loss. Nobody gets up in the morning and does anything expecting to lose money. It's not human nature. But financial markets are probably the place where you have to do that on a reasonably regular basis. So understanding that and coming to terms with that is difficult for a lot of people. And look, rest assured, I've done it more than bigger numbers and fairly more dramatic circumstances, and had to face my own failure over that period. So, I'm happy to share my experiences. I I would have called myself quite introverted years ago. I'm still quite introvert, but I don't have a problem standing on a stage in front of hundreds of people and sharing my life experiences with them. I don't see it as motivational. Sometimes it's described as motivational speaking. I don't see that myself. It's storytelling. But if people can see, take something from it, then that's a positive. So I do an awful lot of speaking, notes, after dinners, and you know, like everything that I've tried to do in life, and the period of my life that's the biggest opposite of that is I've tried to do it as best as I possibly can. But I'm a reasonably sought after speaker. I'm very good at it. Some of that comes through experience, but you know, I suppose some of it comes from being able to judge a crowd and work that as well. So, unfortunately, I will always be remembered for the period of my life which is the most embarrassing, which is that period between 92 and 95, when I was working for Barings in Singapore.
Well, I can vouch for people who've shared backstories with me, and I think you're quite an inspirational character. If there was lots of people who are affected by the collapse of Barings Bank, I'm sure they've got a very different opinion, perhaps of Nick Leeson. But I think by sharing the sort of experiences and the stories for anybody who's an aspiring trader, somebody who wants to get involved in finance, the city, whatever it might be. I think hearing your stories, as you refer to them, is hugely important for them to be able to get a better idea of what life was like, to appreciate perhaps how things have changed in the now. I know that you need to get going. I'm going to take the opportunity to thank you for your time. If you get the opportunity again, feel free to come on. And that's Nick Leeson, the Road Trader. Thanks for your time, mate.
Thank you very much.